Hey everyone. All right, so today we're gonna go through something that I love to geek out on. We're gonna dive deep into the code, but not into NFPA code specifically per se. We're gonna dive into how the condition of participations translates into requirements for hospital facilities. And the reason we're doing this now is, I keep hearing all of this confusion in the industry of, well, how do we meet the condition of participations, and how do we meet Joint Commission or DNV or HVAP standards and code, and how do those all work together? So I'm going to try and clear all that up today by walking us through all the way from the Code of Federal Regulations all the way down to how it applies to hospitals and where all of that comes from. So and there's a point at the end, so hang on until the end because I have a point to make. So really, for hospitals that are deemed through the Center of Medicaid and Medicare Services, CMS, when you accept funding from the government, then you have to meet the requirements of CMS, which is a department of DHHS, the Department of Health and Human Services. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that the government has regulations that they say, hospitals, you have to meet these. So what those are is the Code of Federal Regulations. And what that means is that's really how to implement the law. And the Code of Federal Regulations is, we'll get into what it's part of, but it's broken up into like how to read what it is there's a title, Title 42, and we're gonna come back to that. CFR, which stands for Code of Federal Regulations. This is a fancy sign used by lawyers to indicate section. The part 482, this is actually all important. The section number 41, D, paragraph, 2, subparagraph, right? So that's how to read it. Each title, there's about 50 titles or so. The titles are broken up and annually updated, but broken up into quarters, so that way it doesn't all happen all at once. And so CFR, Title 42 is actually updated every year on October 1st. Each section number is actually regulated by various entities, and you can find that all online, but we're going to talk about that. So CFR is actually part of the permanent rules published by the Federal Register. And the Federal Register is actually really cool. As a lot of you are probably familiar with code update process, things like that for ASHRAE or ICC or for NFPA. There's public input that goes into it. Guess what? There's public input that goes into the Federal Register. They are required by law to publish on their website the changes that they're going to be making, the proposed changes they're going to be making. And we, as the public, can comment on that. And I'm actually going to provide a link down below for everybody. So Section 482 is actually the condition of participations for hospitals. That is why a lot of people hear COP, the condition of participations, and how that works. The regulatory entity responsible for updating Section 482 is, you guessed it, CMS, right? So that's kind of how all of this flows together and where that condition of participations comes from. We're going to run through an example here in a second too. From there, CMS breaks it down further for surveyor guidance for hospitals to go in, or for accrediting organizations, or for the state jurisdiction who does surveys if hospitals don't use accrediting organizations. They break it down further and give additional information known as tags. And we'll talk about the tags, like an example of how it all breaks down. But there are three primary tags that facilities are going to care about. The A tags, which really is clinical governance and physical environment. The K tags, which are life safety requirements, and the E tags, which are emergency preparedness requirements. So, and those tags are published in the State Operations Manual, which is actually part of Appendix A of the guidelines. And it is, Appendix A covers survey protocols and interpretive guidelines for hospitals and how to survey them. And that's important as we get into our example here. So we're going to take a simple example, something everybody knows you have to do every year. You have to do a full flow test of your fire pump, right? Well, that's in the code, but where does that come from? How does that tie back in, let's say, to the to CFR, right? So CFR 42 CFR 482.41 D2, that's this one, right? So what does it say? So we said 482.41, that's the condition of participation for the physical environment, and that's actually where CMS says we use NFPA 101-2012 and NFPA 99-2012. We'll talk about that shortly. And then this D, the paragraph, says hospital must maintain adequate facilities for its services. So it's very high level, right? And then subparagraph breaks it down a little bit further. What does that mean? Facilities, supplies, and equipment must be maintained to ensure an acceptable level of safety and quality. So that's important, right? Because what we're trying to get here is that not every single piece of code is detailed at this level. This is your hospital must be safe, right? So we're talking about that. It's kind of like a pyramid. Then that specifically ties to ATAG 724. Guess what? The actual verbiage is the same, but a lot of tags have interpretive guidelines in the state operations manual. And that tells surveyors, here's some key things to be looking for, right? So, okay, very high level. Okay, a little bit more detail, all right? And then you have accrediting organizations. I've got a few here just to talk through. Joint Commission, which says EC 02, 03, 05, EP 11. And it's very specific on theirs. It says you have to, every 12 months, do an annual flow of your fire pump. And then you have DNV, which is a little bit less prescriptive, because just different model, right, of how they operate. They have physical environment 2, which is the guideline, SR 10, and it just says that you have to test and inspect your life safety systems, right? And where does that come from? Where do how these tie together, right? Well, it goes back to condition of participation for the physical environment, right? So 42 CFR 482, that's 482.41B1I. This is where it's key. The hospital must meet the applicable provisions and must proceed in accordance with the life safety code. That's where this all ties together, right? Well, we know CMS references NFPA 101-2012, which references NFPA 25-2011, and we know that section 8.3.3 says you have to do annual fire pump flow tests. So, to clear up all, this is the key. This is where I said we're going to come back to, right? Okay, to clear all of this up, stop following the prescriptions from your accrediting organizations. You can use that for organization and stuff, but if you are meeting the provisions of the code itself, then you are in compliance with the condition of participations for hospitals. So only look at this, only look at your accrediting organization or your ATAGs or however you are organizing it. Look at it from an organizational perspective only. When you have questions about the actual technical requirements for an ITM program, go back to the code. And that's it. So, I hope this helps. Love to hear your thoughts. And until next time, happy learning.